Welcome to Crazy Karen HOA. The fine meter started before I even grabbed the shovel. Diane Mitchell was standing in my driveway at 7 in the morning, pointing at the temporary car cover I had thrown over my sedan during the freezing rain overnight, and she was already yelling, "You are out of time, and you are out of compliance." She had a clipboard with a clear rain cover clutched in one hand and a bag of ice melt in the other, which she kept jerking back toward herself like it was evidence. I had not even finished my first coffee. The car cover was a basic tarp, the kind you buy at any hardware store, and I had used bungee cords to keep it from blowing away. Diane called it an unapproved cover and said the Saltbox Grove Village Association had a winter emergency policy that banned temporary structures during storm conditions. I had never heard of that policy. She said I had until 9 that morning to remove it, clear my driveway to her satisfaction, and relocate the snow pile at the curb, or she was calling a vendor and billing me. She also said she was writing up a slip hazard because there was black ice near my mailbox. The driveway was a sheet of frozen rain. The streets were a mess. We were in Columbia, Maryland, and the entire region was under a winter storm warning with another wave coming in by afternoon. I work as a building maintenance technician, so I know every code, every safety standard, and every loophole. I also know when someone is making things up. Diane was the board secretary for the HOA, which meant she controlled all the paperwork, all the notices, and all the records. She smiled when she said the vendor part, like she had been waiting for this moment. I asked her to show me the policy. She said it was in the winter addendum. I said I wanted to see the winter addendum. She said homeowners were expected to know the rules, and that requesting documentation during an active violation was not how enforcement worked. That was the moment I knew this was going to be bad. I had moved into Saltbox Grove 2 years ago after a divorce, and my custody schedule meant I had my daughter every other week. The HOA had already targeted my schedule twice, once over a guest parking violation when my sister visited during my custody week, and once over a trash can placement issue the morning I was driving my daughter to school. This felt like round 3. Diane tapped the clipboard and said the winter policy had been in effect since November. I said I never received any notice about a winter policy. She said all notices were posted on the HOA portal and that checking the portal was my responsibility. I had checked the portal 2 days ago when I paid my monthly dues. There was nothing about a winter addendum. I told her that. She said maybe I missed it. Then she looked at the car cover again and said it was a code violation under the temporary structure clause and that she was noting the exact time of non-compliance. It was 7:14 in the morning. She said I had until 9 or the vendor would be here. I asked what vendor. Diane said the association had a contract with a local towing and snow removal company that handled emergency compliance. I asked if she meant they were going to tow my car. She said no, they were going to remove the cover, clear my snow pile, and bill me for the labor, but if I refused access, they could tow for obstruction. I said that sounded illegal. She said it was in the enforcement guidelines and that homeowners signed an acknowledgement of emergency powers when they closed on their property. I did not remember signing anything like that, but I also knew that closing paperwork is a stack of documents you initial in a blur. She started walking toward my snow pile, which was just a low ridge of plowed snow at the curb where the county plow had pushed it. She said the pile was encroaching on the sidewalk and creating a pedestrian hazard. I looked at the sidewalk. There was about 8 inches of clearance. The snow was not blocking anything. She pulled out a small folding ruler from her coat pocket, crouched down, and started measuring the distance from the edge of the snow pile to the edge of the sidewalk. I watched her do this for a full minute while snow fell on both of us. She wrote a number on the clipboard. Then she stood up, looked at me and said the association required 12 inches of clearance during winter months and that I was 4 inches short. I asked where that measurement rule was written. She said it was in the same winter addendum. I said I wanted to see it in writing. She said I could file a records request with the management company, but that would take 3 business days, and the violation was active right now. That was when I realized she was not just making this up as theater, she was setting up a paper trail. If I did nothing, she would have a compliance record showing I refused to fix a documented hazard. If I did something, she would have proof I acknowledged the violation. Either way, she won the documentation game. I told her I needed to make a phone call. She said I had until 9. Then she turned and walked back toward the clubhouse, which was 2 streets over, still holding the clipboard and the bag of ice melt like props in a performance. I went inside, grabbed my phone, and called my family attorney, a guy named Rick Chen, who had helped me with the custody agreement and who I knew through my sister. Rick was not officially my HOA lawyer, but he had dealt with property disputes before and he understood how these things worked. I explained the situation in about 90 seconds. Rick said it sounded like Diane was trying to create a pretext for fees and that I should not do anything until I saw the actual policy. He said if she called a vendor, I should let them show up, document everything, and then dispute the charges. He also said I should take photos of the driveway, the car cover, the snow pile and the sidewalk clearance right now, before anything changed. I thanked him and hung up. Then I went outside with my phone and started taking pictures. The car cover, the bungee cords, the snow pile, the sidewalk, the black ice on my driveway, the ruler marks in the snow where Diane had measured. I took about 40 photos in 10 minutes. At 8:30, a tow truck with a distinctive amber strobe pulled up in front of my house. The driver got out, looked at my driveway, looked at the car cover, and then made a phone call. I walked outside. The driver was a middle-aged guy in a heavy coat and work gloves. He said he was here for a compliance removal. I asked who called him. He said the HOA secretary. I asked what he was supposed to remove. He said the temporary cover and the snow obstruction. I asked if he had a work order. He showed me a printout with the Saltbox Grove Village Association letterhead at the top and a description of the work. The description said unauthorized temporary structure and pedestrian hazard. There was no mention of the specific policy being violated. I took a photo of the work order. The driver asked if I was going to comply voluntarily or if he needed to proceed. I said I was not consenting to any removal and that I was disputing the violation. He said that was fine, but he was still authorized to proceed under the HOA enforcement contract. He walked over to my car, started unfastening the bungee cords, and pulled the tarp off. Then he folded it, walked back to his truck, and put it in the flatbed. I asked what he was doing with my tarp. He said it would be held as evidence of the violation and returned after the compliance hearing. I said that was theft. He said it was contractual enforcement. Then he walked over to the snow pile with a shovel, scooped about half of it into a wheelbarrow he pulled from his truck, and moved it 6 feet down the curb. The whole process took maybe 10 minutes. When he was done, he handed me a receipt with no readable text and said I would receive a billing statement from the association within 5 business days. Then, he got in his truck and drove away, amber strobe still flashing. I stood in my driveway, watching the tow truck disappear, and felt the knot tighten in my chest. The car was fine, the snow pile was moved, but I was out a tarp. I had no idea what the bill would be, and I had just been steamrolled by a system I did not even know existed. I went back inside and called Rick again. He said this was worse than he thought, because if the HOA had an enforcement contract that allowed vendors to take property without a hearing, that was a serious due process problem. He said I needed to get a copy of that contract, a copy of the winter addendum Diane kept referencing, and any records showing when and how that policy was adopted. He also said I should file a formal dispute with the management company immediately, in writing, and request a hearing. He said if they refused, we could escalate, but we needed the documentation first. I asked how long that would take. Rick said probably 2 weeks if they cooperated, longer if they stalled. I told him I had to meet a neighbor at the mailbox cluster before the next storm wave hit that afternoon, because the neighbor had seen Diane measuring driveways up and down the street that morning, and I wanted a witness statement. Rick said that was smart. He told me to keep every receipt, every photo, every email, and every text. Then he said something I will never forget. He said Diane was playing a long game, and the only way to win was to play a longer one. The second storm wave hit at 2 in the afternoon. By 3, the streets were worse than the morning. I got a text from my neighbor Angela, who lived 4 houses down. She said she was at the mailbox cluster and that I should come now if I wanted to talk. I put my coat back on, grabbed my phone, and walked down the street. The sidewalks were a mess. The county had not plowed yet. Angela was standing by the mailboxes with her arms crossed, wearing a thick parka and boots. She said she had been outside shoveling her front walk that morning when Diane came through, and she had watched the whole ruler routine. Angela said Diane had measured at least 6 driveways on our street and written notes on every single one. I asked if Diane had said anything to her. Angela said Diane told her the winter policy was being enforced strictly this year because of liability concerns, and that anyone with a snow pile within 12 inches of the sidewalk edge would receive a notice. Angela said she asked to see the policy, and Diane gave her the same line about the portal. Angela checked the portal on her phone right there. Nothing. She said Diane just smiled and said the addendum was in the members-only section. Angela tried to log into the members-only section. It was password protected and required board approval for access. Angela said that was when she knew something was wrong. She asked me if I had gotten a notice yet. I told her about the vendor, the tarp, and the tow truck. Angela said that was insane. Then she said something that made my stomach drop. She said her husband had gotten a certified letter 2 days ago demanding a $200 fine for a snowpile violation from December, even though they had cleared their driveway within 24 hours of the storm. The letter said the fine was cumulative and that additional violations would result in a lien. Angela said they were going to pay it because they did not want the hassle, but now she was wondering if the whole thing was a shakedown. I asked Angela if she still had the letter. She said yes. I asked if I could see it. She pulled out her phone, opened her photos, and showed me a picture of the letter. It had the Saltbox Grove Village Association letterhead, a case number, a date, and a paragraph describing the violation. The violation was listed as failure to maintain pedestrian clearance during active snow conditions. The fine was $200, due within 10 days, and the letter said failure to pay would result in additional administrative fees and possible lien filing. At the bottom there was a signature block. The signature was Diane Mitchell, board secretary. I took a photo of Angela's photo. Then I asked her if she remembered the exact date of the December storm. She said it was December 8th. I asked when she cleared the driveway. She said December 9th, in the morning. I asked when the letter was dated. She checked the photo. January 7th. I did the math. That was 30 days after the storm. Angela said she did not even know there was a violation until the letter showed up. No warning, no inspection notice, nothing. Just a bill. I told Angela this was exactly the kind of thing Rick had warned me about. I said Diane was building a pattern of violations to justify liens and vendor contracts, and she was doing it without proper notice or hearings. Angela said she wanted to fight it, but she did not know how. I said I was filing a records request and a dispute, and if she wanted to join, we could coordinate. Angela said yes immediately. Then she said there was something else. She said a plow contractor who worked for the county had been parked near her house that morning, pretending not to listen, but she was pretty sure he heard the whole exchange with Diane. She said the contractor had been sitting in his truck with the window cracked, drinking coffee, and when Diane walked away, he shook his head like he had seen this before. I asked if Angela got his name. She said no, but she could probably find him if we needed a witness. I said we might. That night, I sat down and wrote a formal dispute letter to the management company. I included the photos, the receipt from the vendor, the timeline of events, and a request for the following documents: the winter addendum Diane had referenced, the enforcement contract with the tow company, the meeting minutes where the winter policy was adopted, and any records showing notification to home owners about the policy change. I also requested a hearing under the association bylaws. I sent the letter via email and certified mail. The next morning, I got an auto reply from the management company saying my request had been received and would be reviewed within 5 to 7 business days. That same morning, I got a certified letter from the HOA. I signed for it, opened it, and felt my blood pressure spike. The letter was from Diane. It said I was being assessed a $400 emergency compliance fee for the vendor removal on the morning of the storm, plus a $50 administrative processing fee, plus a $100 violation fine for the unapproved temporary structure. Total, $550. The letter said the fees were due within 10 days, and that failure to pay would result in additional late fees of $25 per day, plus possible lien filing. At the bottom, in bold text, it said this was not a debate and that the compliance actions were final unless overturned by a formal board vote. The letter was dated the same day as the vendor removal. Diane had written the bill before the vendor even showed up. I forwarded the letter to Rick immediately. He called me 10 minutes later. He said the fees were almost certainly unenforceable because I had not been given notice of the policy, I had not been given an opportunity to cure, and the vendor removal happened without a hearing. He said the $25 per day late fee was also likely illegal under Maryland HOA law, which caps late fees and requires specific procedures. He said I should not pay anything and that we should escalate this to the board. He also said we needed to find out who else had been hit with these fees, because if this was a pattern, we could argue selective enforcement or even fraud. I told him about Angela's letter. Rick said that was good. He said we needed more. I spent the next 2 days reaching out to neighbors. I knocked on doors, sent emails through the neighborhood group chat, and posted a vague message on the HOA portal asking if anyone else had received winter violation notices. Within 24 hours, I had responses from 8 families. 6 had received letters, 4 had already paid. 2 were disputing. One family said they had been threatened with towing for parking on the street during a storm, even though the county had not declared a parking ban. Another family said their mailbox area had been cited for ice accumulation, and they had been billed $150 for salt application they never requested. Every single letter was signed by Diane Mitchell. Every single letter referenced the winter addendum. Not one person had seen the actual policy. I compiled everything into a spreadsheet: dates, violation descriptions, fees, payment status, and whether people had received prior notice. Then I sent the spreadsheet to Rick. He looked at it and said this was a goldmine. He said if the board had adopted a winter policy without proper notice and was using it to generate fees through a vendor contract, that was a breach of fiduciary duty and possibly a kickback scheme. He said we needed to get inside that vendor contract and see if Diane or anyone else on the board had a financial stake. He also said we needed to force a board meeting and make this public. I asked how. Rick said the bylaws probably allowed homeowners to petition for a special meeting if they got enough signatures. He told me to check the governing documents. I pulled up the Saltbox Grove Village Association bylaws from the portal. Section 12 said any homeowner could petition for a special meeting if they collected signatures from at least 20% of the membership. We had about 200 homes in the association. That meant I needed 40 signatures. I started going door to door. It took me 4 days to get 42 signatures. Most people signed immediately once I explained the fee pattern. A few were scared of retaliation and declined. One guy said he was on Diane's side because he thought the neighborhood looked sloppy during storms and someone needed to enforce standards. I thanked him and moved on. On the 5th day, I submitted the petition to the management company with a cover letter requesting a special meeting within 14 days, per the bylaws. The management company acknowledged receipt. 2 days later, I got a phone call from the property manager, a woman named Lisa Ortiz. She said the board had reviewed my petition and agreed to hold a meeting, but that the meeting would be limited to violation disputes and would not include discussion of internal policies or vendor contracts. I said that was unacceptable and that the bylaws did not allow the board to limit the agenda of a petitioned meeting. Lisa said the board had discretion over meeting procedures. I said we would see about that. She said the meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday at 7 in the evening at the clubhouse. She also said I would have 10 minutes to present my case, and that all documentation had to be submitted 72 hours in advance. I said fine. Then, she said one more thing. She said Diane had requested that I be barred from speaking due to abusive conduct during the vendor removal. I asked what abusive conduct. Lisa said Diane had filed a report claiming I had threatened the vendor and used profanity. I said that was a lie. Lisa said the report was on file and that the board would review it before the meeting. Then, she hung up. I called Rick immediately. He said the abusive conduct claim was a setup and that we needed to get ahead of it. He said I should write a rebuttal statement, include the photos and timeline showing I had been calm and cooperative, and submit it with my meeting materials. He also said we needed to subpoena the vendor and get his statement, because if he contradicted Diane's report, that was evidence of false statements. I said I did not know how to subpoena someone for an HOA meeting. Rick said we could not subpoena for an HOA meeting, but we could contact the vendor directly and ask him to provide a written statement. He said most vendors do not want to get dragged into HOA drama and will either cooperate or stay neutral. I asked if he could draft a letter. Rick said he would have something to me by the next morning. That night, I could not sleep. I kept replaying the morning of the vendor removal in my head, trying to remember every word I had said. I had been frustrated, yes, but I had not yelled. I had not sworn, and I had not threatened anyone. Diane was lying, and she was doing it to shut me up before the meeting. The next morning, Rick sent me a draft letter addressed to the tow truck driver. The letter explained that there was a dispute over the vendor removal and requested a written statement describing the driver's interactions with me on the morning in question. The letter was polite, professional, and included a prepaid return envelope. Rick said to mail it certified so we had proof of delivery. I printed the letter, signed it, and took it to the post office. Then I started working on my meeting presentation. I pulled together the photos, the fee letters, the spreadsheet of violations, Angela's testimony, and the timeline. I wrote a 3-page summary arguing that the winter addendum had never been properly adopted, that homeowners had not been notified, and that the vendor contract was being used to generate fees without oversight. I also included a section on Diane's false report and attached the vendor receipt showing the driver had noted my cooperation. I submitted everything to the management company 72 hours before the meeting, as required. 2 days before the meeting, I got a response from the tow truck driver. He said he remembered the removal and that I had been polite and professional. He said he had no record of any abusive conduct and that his notes indicated I had complied with his request to stay back while he worked. He said he was willing to provide a statement if needed. I forwarded his email to Rick. Rick said that was perfect and that we should print it and bring copies to the meeting. The day before the meeting, the neighborhood group chat exploded. Someone had posted a screenshot of an email from Diane that had been sent to the full board but accidentally copied to the neighborhood distribution list. The email said the winter enforcement program had generated over $12,000 in fees in the first 6 weeks, and that the vendor contract was renewable annually with a performance bonus if collections exceeded $15,000. The email also said the board should prepare to defend the program at the meeting and that Diane had drafted talking points for each board member. The email ended with a line that made my jaw drop. "We can tow first and explain later. That is how enforcement works." The group chat went insane. People were posting crying, laughing emojis, angry faces, and demands for Diane's resignation. Someone said they were forwarding the email to a local news station. Someone else said they were calling a lawyer. Angela posted a message saying she was bringing her husband to the meeting and that they were not paying the fine. Another neighbor said the same thing. By midnight, the group chat had over 300 messages, and at least 20 people had confirmed they were coming to the meeting. I screenshotted the email and sent it to Rick. He called me at 7 in the morning. He said the email was the smoking gun and that we needed to make sure it was part of the official record. He also said the tow first and explain later line was evidence of bad faith enforcement and that we could use it to argue for rescission of all the fees. He told me to print copies and distribute them at the meeting. If you are enjoying this HOA revenge story, hit that like button and subscribe for more neighborhood justice content. Thursday came. The meeting was at 7. I got there at 6:30. The clubhouse parking lot was already full. I had to park on the street. When I walked in, the main meeting room was packed. There were at least 60 people in a space that seated 40. People were standing along the walls, sitting on the floor, and crowding into the doorway. The board table was set up at the front of the room with 5 chairs. Diane was already sitting in the center chair, wearing a blazer and holding a binder. The other 4 board members looked nervous. Lisa Ortiz was sitting off to the side with a laptop. I found a seat near the back and set my folder on my lap. Angela waved at me from across the room. Rick had said he could not attend because of a scheduling conflict, but he told me to record the meeting on my phone if the bylaws allowed it. I checked the bylaws. They did. I set my phone on my lap and hit record. The meeting started 10 minutes late because people kept arriving. Diane called the meeting to order and said the board had agreed to hear disputes related to winter violations, but that the agenda was limited and personal attacks would not be tolerated. She said each speaker would have 5 minutes and that interruptions would result in removal from the meeting. Then she looked directly at me and said the board had reviewed a report of abusive conduct and determined that I could speak, but that any further violations of conduct policies would result in a ban from future meetings. I stayed quiet. Diane opened the floor for comments. The first speaker was a guy named Tom who lived on the next street over. Tom said he had been fined for a snowpile violation even though he had hired a private plow company to clear his driveway within hours of the storm. He said the fine was unfair and that he wanted a refund. Diane said the fine was valid because the plow company had pushed snow onto the sidewalk, creating a hazard. Tom said the sidewalk was county property and that the HOA had no authority over it. Diane said the winter addendum gave the board authority to enforce pedestrian safety within the community. Tom asked to see the addendum. Diane said it was available on the portal. Tom said he checked the portal and there was nothing there. Diane said he must have missed it. Tom said he wanted proof. Diane said the meeting was not a document review session and that Tom could file a records request. Then she moved to the next speaker. The next speaker was Angela. She said she had paid a $200 fine under protest and that she wanted it refunded. She said the fine was based on a violation that occurred 30 days before she was notified, and that the delay violated due process. She also said she had checked the HOA bylaws and found no provision allowing the board to impose fines without a hearing. Diane said the winter addendum included an emergency powers clause that allowed the board to act immediately during active storm conditions. Angela said the storm was over when the fine was issued. Diane said the emergency period extended for 72 hours after the storm ended. Angela asked where that was written. Diane gave the same answer about the portal. Angela said this was ridiculous and sat down. The room started murmuring. Diane banged a gavel and said she would clear the room if people did not remain quiet. The murmuring stopped, but the tension was thick. 3 more speakers went up, all with similar complaints. Diane gave the same responses every time. No one was getting anywhere. Then it was my turn. I walked to the front of the room, set my folder on the podium, and started with the facts. I said I had been cited for a violation on the morning of a winter storm, that a vendor had been called without my consent, that my property had been removed without a hearing, and that I had been billed $550 for services I did not authorize. I said the violation was based on a winter addendum that no one could produce, and that I had submitted a records request for the policy 3 weeks ago and still had not received a response. I said the management company was in violation of Maryland HOA law, which required document requests to be fulfilled within 10 business days. Diane interrupted and said my time was limited to 5 minutes and that I needed to stay on topic. I said I was on topic. I pulled out the spreadsheet and said I had documented 12 families who had been cited for winter violations in the past 8 weeks, and that the total fees assessed exceeded $15,000. I said 6 of those families had paid under protest and that none of them had seen the winter addendum before being fined. Diane interrupted again and said the winter addendum had been adopted at the November board meeting and posted to the portal. I said I wanted to see the meeting minutes. Diane said the minutes were available on request. I said I had requested them 3 weeks ago and they had not been provided. Diane said there must have been a delay. I said that was convenient. Then I pulled out the email screenshot and held it up. I said the board had accidentally sent an email to the neighborhood distribution list that admitted the winter enforcement program was a revenue generator and that the vendor contract included a performance bonus tied to fee collections. I read the line about towing first and explaining later. The room erupted. People started shouting questions. Someone yelled that the board was running a scam. Someone else yelled that Diane should resign. Diane banged the gavel and said the email was taken out of context and that the enforcement program was about safety, not revenue. I said the email spoke for itself. Then I pulled out the tow truck driver's statement and read it aloud. I said the driver had confirmed that I was cooperative and professional during the removal and that Diane's abusive conduct report was false. I said filing a false report to silence a homeowner was retaliation and possibly defamation. Diane stood up and said I was out of line. I said I was stating facts. Diane said my time was up. I said I had 30 seconds left. I used those 30 seconds to say that I was requesting the board to rescind all winter violation fees, terminate the vendor contract, and produce the winter addendum with proof of proper adoption, or I would be filing a complaint with the Maryland Homeowners Association Oversight Board and considering leg. All action for breach of fiduciary duty. Then I sat down. The room was chaos. Diane tried to regain control, but people were shouting over her. One of the other board members, a man named Steve, stood up and said he wanted to address the room. He said he had not been aware of the vendor contract bonus structure and that he was concerned about the lack of documentation. He said he was requesting an internal audit of the winter enforcement program. Another board member, a woman named Claire, said she agreed. Diane said an audit was unnecessary and that the program was fully compliant. Steve said he was making a motion to suspend all winter violation collections pending the audit. Claire seconded the motion. Diane said the motion was out of order because it was not on the agenda. Steve said the bylaws allowed board members to make motions at any meeting. Diane said she was ruling the motion out of order as board president. Steve said Diane was the secretary, not the president. Diane said the president was absent and she was acting president. Steve said that was not how it worked. The room was watching this like a tennis match. Claire said she was calling for a vote on the motion regardless of Diane's ruling. 2 other board members raised their hands in favor. Diane was outvoted 4-1. The motion passed. All winter violation fees were suspended pending an internal audit. Diane looked like she had been slapped. She said the board was making a mistake and that homeowners would exploit the suspension. Steve said the board had a fiduciary duty to ensure enforcement was lawful and transparent. He said the audit would be completed within 30 days and that the results would be shared with the membership. Then he said one more thing. He said the board was also voting to prohibit Diane from communicating directly with homeowners about violations and that all enforcement actions would go through the management company moving forward. Claire seconded that motion too. It passed 4-1. Diane was ordered to stop contacting me directly. The room erupted again, but this time, it was applause. Diane sat down, stone-faced, and stared at her binder. Lisa Ortiz looked like she wanted to disappear. The meeting wrapped up 20 minutes later. As people filed out, at least a dozen homeowners came up to me and thanked me. Angela hugged me. Tom shook my hand and said he was glad someone finally stood up to Diane. I felt like I had just run a marathon. The next day, I got an email from Lisa Ortiz. She said the management company was conducting the audit and that I would receive a preliminary report within 2 weeks. She also said my records request for the winter addendum and vendor contract had been escalated and that I would receive the documents within 5 business days. 3 days later, I got a package in the mail. It contained the vendor contract, the meeting minutes from November, and a letter from Lisa. The letter said the winter addendum had never been formally adopted. The November meeting minutes showed that Diane had proposed a winter enforcement policy, but the board had tabled the discussion pending legal review. The legal review had never happened. The policy had never been voted on. Diane had been enforcing a rule that did not exist. The vendor contract showed that the towing company was owned by Diane's brother-in-law and that Diane received a consulting fee for every compliance action. The whole thing was a kickback scheme. I forwarded the package to Rick immediately. He said this was bigger than an HOA dispute and that I should consider filing a fraud complaint with the state attorney general. He also said the vendor contract was likely voidable and that I could demand a full refund of all fees paid to the company. I gave her a small thank you, because she just handed me leverage. But I was not done. I had been holding a trump card this whole time, and now was the moment to play it. During my door-to-door signature gathering, I had also been collecting photos from neighbors who had been cited for winter violations. What I found was that at least 15 other homeowners had snow piles, driveway conditions, or temporary covers that were identical to mine, but they had never been cited. Some of them were board members or friends of board members. I compiled the photos into a side-by-side comparison packet showing the selective enforcement. I labeled it evidence of discriminatory application of rules, and I had been waiting for the right moment to deploy it. The right moment was now. I sent the packet to Lisa Ortiz with a cover letter requesting that the board issue a formal retraction of my violation, a written apology, and a policy change requiring all enforcement actions to be reviewed by an independent third party before fees were assessed. I also sent copies to the state HOA Oversight Board and to a local news reporter who had been covering HOA disputes in the region. The news reporter called me 2 days later. She said she was working on a story about HOA overreach and asked if I would be willing to go on camera. I said yes. The story aired the following week. It included interviews with me, Angela, Tom, and 3 other homeowners who had been targeted by Diane's enforcement scheme. The reporter also interviewed Steve, the board member who had called for the audit. Steve said the board was taking the situation seriously and that Diane had been removed from her position as secretary pending the outcome of the investigation. The story included screenshots of the vendor contract and the email about towing first and explaining later. It was devastating. Within 48 hours, the Saltbox Grove Village Association was getting calls from other news stations, bloggers, and even a state legislator who said he was considering introducing a bill to regulate HOA enforcement contracts. The board went into full damage control mode. Lisa Ortiz sent an email to the entire membership saying the winter enforcement program had been terminated, all fees were being refunded, and the vendor contract had been canceled. She also said Diane had resigned from the board effective immediately. The email included an apology to all homeowners who had been affected and a commitment to implement new oversight procedures. 2 weeks later, I got a formal letter from the management company. The letter said my winter violation had been retracted in writing, that the $550 fee had been voided, and that I would receive a check for the full amount within 30 days. The letter also said the towing company had agreed to return my tarp and issue a written statement confirming that no abusive conduct had occurred during the removal. The letter ended with a sentence that made me smile. The board has determined that the enforcement action taken against your property was not supported by properly adopted policies and apologizes for any inconvenience caused. I framed that letter and hung it in my garage. A week after that, I got a call from the towing company. The driver I had dealt with on the morning of the storm said his boss wanted to apologize personally and that the company was refunding all charges related to Saltbox Grove enforcement actions. He said they had reviewed the vendor contract and realized they had been used as part of a scheme they wanted no part of. He said they were canceling the HOA contract and that they would not be working with Diane or anyone associated with her in the future. I thanked him and told him I appreciated his integrity. The fallout continued for months. The State HOA Oversight Board opened an investigation into the Saltbox Grove Village Association and found multiple violations of Maryland HOA law, including failure to provide proper notice of rule changes, improper fee assessments, and conflict of interest in vendor contracts. The board was fined and required to implement a compliance program. Diane was banned from serving on any HOA board in Maryland for 5 years. Her brother-in-law's towing company lost its county contract after the news story aired, and other municipalities started asking questions. The board held a special election to replace Diane and 2 other members who resigned in the aftermath. Steve was elected president. Claire was elected vice president. One of the first things the new board did was adopt a transparency policy requiring all enforcement actions to be documented and reviewed by a committee before fees were assessed. They also posted all governing documents, meeting minutes, and financial reports on the portal with no password restrictions. The neighborhood group chat became a place for actual community discussion instead of complaint venting. People started organizing snow removal help for elderly neighbors. Someone started a winter safety committee that coordinated with the county on plowing schedules. The whole culture shifted. As for me, I kept my head down and focused on my custody schedule and my job. My daughter asked me once why there were so many people talking about snow rules, and I told her that sometimes grown-ups make things more complicated than they need to be, but that it usually works out if you stand up for what is right. She said that made sense. I never saw Diane again. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she moved to a condo in another county. I do not know if that is true, but I hope she learned something from the experience. I doubt it, but I can hope. The vendor removal that started this whole mess cost me a tarp, a few sleepless nights, and a lot of time I will never get back. But in the end, I got my refund. I got my retraction. I got my apology, and I got to watch a corrupt system collapse under the weight of its own paperwork. That is about as good as it gets in HOA disputes. Until next time, keep your receipts.